These days in Canada, we spend a lot of time talking about hydrocarbons. We spend a lot less time talking about electricity and electricity systems. But because of the energy transition, it's electricity where we really need to focus our attention. And the CD Howe Institute has published a study about Canadian electricity prices and some of the policy implications. So we're going to be talking to Grant Bishop from CD Howe about that. Welcome to the interview, Grant.
Great to be here, Markham. Thanks for having me.
Now, let's talk about the electricity prices across Canada. So Alberta and Ontario are generally higher than everybody else. And let me see, Quebec, Newfoundland, Manitoba, and BC are much lower than everybody else. Why is that?
Yeah, well, I guess just as background to our report, Markham, the purpose of this was to fill this gap in understanding the relative system costs for power, as well as the composition of costs facing different consumer classes, residential, commercial, industrial. What you point to is one of the conclusions of our research, comparing across all the provinces the overall system costs and normalizing those for the amount of domestic power consumed. As you note, Ontario, Alberta, Nova Scotia are at the top end. It is a bit difficult to compare just the sources of overall costs for province. Different provinces constitute their electricity systems differently. Ontario and Alberta are not vertically integrated with a single or near monopoly provider of power, whereas other provinces, BC, Quebec, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, do have that crown corporation. And so, for Ontario and Alberta, we can break apart the costs in the stack between the cost of providing generation capacity and the costs of transmission and distribution services, as well as the system operator. For other jurisdictions, other provinces, those are bundled. And so it's difficult to see in. One thing, though, we do see across provinces, comparing, for example, the share of hydroelectricity used in a given province versus the overall cost, is a relationship between those provinces that are more hydroelectricity intensive in their generation being at the lower end of costs.
Now, let's talk about how some of those costs are allocated, because as you mentioned, the big publicly owned utilities, those costs aren't as transparent. But one of the things I do know, because lived in Alberta, have many friends and family in Alberta, everybody complains about how cheap the electricity is and how much the additional costs are when they look at their bill. Is that part of it? Is that a problem, or is that a bug or a feature?
Well, so within the energy market, I think there are valuable features to our energy-only market. It is transparent, it's competitive, and that is the incentive for new players to enter. Where the cost is persistently too high, you have an opportunity to put in more generation capacity and get some of that infra-marginal profit in economic speak. Where Alberta certainly has seen a drive upwards in cost is on that transmission and distribution front. That's the place where we've seen the greater growth at the system cost level, and as well for particular consumers. That's where they have seen the costs increase. The benefit of having an energy-only market is that you can see what different producers are offering into it, and it's the marginal offer that sets at any point in time the price. It's more clearly supply and demand that is dictating the price that consumers pay. And that goes to the relative energy costs that Albertans see. But just as you say, the per kilowatt hour cost can be more because of what's being charged in transmission and distribution as well.
So that raises the question, in the publicly owned utilities, are we seeing governments through the crown utilities hide some of those costs in order to drive down, artificially maybe drive down costs because it's politically advantageous for them?
And what we did in our report was included the the full income from domestic consumers, inclusive of any regulatory deferrals. That was the way that we tried to get at least one aspect of that question of, are you comparing apples to apples when you're comparing a crown utility to a competitive market? You know, we didn't look back through history and examine some of the debt subsidies or even direct payments or forgiveness that you may have seen in some of these jurisdictions, but at least on the 2018 year, we're fairly confident we're capturing all of the sources of revenue that a given power entity is either receiving in cash or putting into their regulatory deferral accounts. And on that basis, it's a reasonable year-to-year apples-to-apples comparison.
Now, the next policy implication I want to talk about that you discuss is market design. And I know that some viewers are probably, their eyes are going to glaze over, but this is really important because what we're seeing across across really the world is technologies and other policies are forcing utilities, forcing regulators to redesign markets. Utilities are redesigning their business models, and there's going to be, there already is, but there's going to be increasingly be a whole lot more flexibility and options for consumers, whether they be residential or business or industrial. That's the exciting part. Market design is probably the boring part, but let's talk about market design.
Yeah, and there are many advantages on the design of a market. I mean, one of the things we are most keen on in the report is seeing an alignment between the prices that consumers pay and the marginal cost of generation or capacity to deliver power. We point to that where you have misalignment, you create bad incentives within a system for overbuilding or underbuilding or pushing consumers behind the fence for generation capacity that may be load or grid defection. You want as close as possible to align the marginal price with the marginal cost. There is another question, though, where you have in electricity systems such large fixed costs of how you then distribute those in the most efficient way. And one of the things we point to conceptually as a lens is this of Ramsey pricing, so-called, the pricing in accordance with the relative elasticity of a particular customer or group. And you can see attempts to do this in the form of certain fixed charges or variable charges that may step down for larger consumers tied to the components of the system that are truly fixed costs. You know, here, back to the other advantage on market design, in a competitive system like Alberta's, where there are offers into the market and marginal offer sets the price in real time, you're more confident that at least on the energy price, you have consumers paying a price that is for energy aligned with what it costs to generate it. In other jurisdictions, you may be you may not be as aligned, and that goes to some of the questions about the transparency of certain of these markets. As well, with certain types of resources, there's zero cost, marginal cost in dispatching them, but you may have opportunity cost, and that gets into a more nuanced exercise.
We'll leave that nuanced conversation for another one, but I've got one last question for you. And that is, and I'm fond of saying that going forward in the low carbon future, cheap, abundant, low carbon electricity is going to be a competitive advantage for whatever jurisdiction is able to secure that. And I think that's one of your third policy implication of pointed out in your study. Could you describe that a little bit?
Well, carbon pricing is, of course, integral to that, that ultimately any producer of a good faces a common set of costs for using the atmospheric resources for producing carbon. You would then, if that carbon price is evenly, uniformly applied, expect for any offer into the market to any decision to dispatch an asset to include the cost of carbon for doing that. And I think there's good argument that we've seen that in Alberta for various ways of how we do carbon pricing, the output-based nature of our pricing system. We haven't seen it impact prices with any sort of spike. But the carbon competitiveness, as we increase the carbon price and potentially move away from output-based pricing towards maybe more of a uniform carbon cost per ton, that certainly is going to be a major driver of relative system competitiveness. And then the prices that consumers face and the incentives to locate in a particular jurisdiction if you're a heavy user of power.
Grant, thank you very much for this. We'll be back to talk more about market design, I'm sure, in the future. Thank you again.
Thank you, Markham, and invite your listeners to view our report. We're happy to answer any other questions about it.